This lecture is about odor reproduction, and I will explain what that means. And about 2/3 of it will be about the problem itself and why it is so difficult. And then the last part will be about an interesting question around this problem and how I propose to answer it. So the first thing I like to do in this kind of lecture is to ask if anyone in the audience knows what this is. So I don't have direct connection with the audience here because this lecture is being recorded. So I will give the answer right now. And so this is the first photo ever taken by Niepce about 1826 or 27. So this, of course, is a photograph without very good resolution, which is fine because it was the first one ever taken. I like to think of this as an unbelievable breakthrough, the first time that some, let's say, scene or view was captured not by a painting or by a drawing, but by some chemical or electronic means. This photo still exists on some metal plate somewhere in some museum. I also like to ask what people think this is. And no, it's not the second photograph ever taken, but it is the first photograph which shows people. Down here on the bottom left, you can see, I think this is a shoe cleaner with a customer cleaning or polishing his or her shoes. This is also quite remarkable because, you know, paintings and drawings of kings and queens and princes and so on have been around for almost forever, but a real person captured in a way that is not by painting or by drawing, this is the first time. So here we see a breakthrough which involves capturing a piece of visual, like a sight or a picture, and keeping it and being able, of course, to reproduce it and send it electronically to wherever we want. The analogous breakthrough in audio, in sound, was interestingly exactly 50 years after Niepce, and this was the first telephone call famously made by Alexander Graham Bell. This photograph, as far as I know, is not of the first telephone call, but I think it's of the first phone call he made cross-Atlantic. But the first telephone call was the famous occasion when Alexander Graham Bell summoned his assistant from a room nearby, saying, "Mr. Watson, can you come here, please? I want to talk to you." Of course, this is not Sherlock Holmes' Watson. This is Alexander Graham Bell's Watson. And of course, the amazing thing about this breakthrough is that he came. Mr. Watson came, which means that he understood, he recognized what was being said, and he came. Just like in Niepce's photograph, if you were to be with him in his room, you would be able to recognize and identify the scene which I think he took out of his window in his apartment. And I would like to talk here about exactly the same kind of thing, but not related to the sense of sight or of hearing, not video or audio, but about the sense of smell, which of course we call olfaction. So what is an odor reproduction system? I think it would be beneficial if the viewers keep in mind throughout the lecture, actually, an analogy with, say, digital photography. So in digital photography, we have a camera and we go click and we capture something and then we can reproduce it, say, by a laser printer or by an inkjet printer on a piece of paper or on a screen. And the same thing is what we want here. We want some device, which I will call the sniffer, which is analogous to the camera, sniffing something that has smell, has an odor, say a rose, and then it gets kind of digitized or gets captured in a way that can be reproduced and sent elsewhere, and in such a way that the code is entered into a computer which is endowed with algorithms or mathematics. And what we want as a result is we want this computer with its software to give instructions to an output device, which I will be calling the whiffer. So the sniffer sniffs, the whiffer whiffs. And of course, we want the result to be something that can be smelled and recognized. And the only way we can smell, at least nowadays, is by actual molecules entering our nose. So what we want, have a little sound effect here. So we want it to be the case that this output device, the whiffer, emits actual molecules with the property that if they enter an average human being who has a sense of smell, of course, their nostrils, then that person identifies the odor as being consistent with the original, in this case, a rose. So what I'd like to say about this slide is we want the rose to pose in your nose as a rose. And the important word here, of course, is pose. These molecules that enter this person's nostrils do not necessarily have to be the same or even similar molecules to the ones that an actual rose emits. That's why we use the word pose or mimic. All we need is for this person to think, to recognize that what he is smelling or she is smelling is the odor of a rose. Just like if I take a picture with my digital camera and print it on paper, the actual colors are not necessarily the colors of the ink that I happen to have inside my printer, but the mixture of them gives a sufficiently accurate color for each pixel on the screen, and the overall effect is that I recognize the picture that is printed, the image that is printed, as being a good rendition, suitably good rendition of the original. The same is what we want here. Such a system, an odor reproduction system, would have numerous applications, TVs and movies, online purchasing. I often purchase flowers for people on occasion, and of course I get to see the flowers on the screen, I get to pay for them, and so on, but I don't get to smell them, and I have to kind of make up in my mind what the smell would be like. Cooking programs, computer games, medical diagnosis. I had a colleague who is no longer alive who used to be able to identify streptococcus with very, very high accuracy by breathing in, by smelling the odor of a baby's breath. And of course, there are industries which are directly related to odor, such as the food and cosmetic industries, and so on and so forth. If you think to yourselves, what do TV and movies and computer games have to do with this? Well, I mean, I think that if you were to see a movie and you were able to smell in real time the burning of the screeching tires when the good guys are after the bad guys, that would be really wonderful. I was involved in a company about 20 years ago, and the company collapsed when the NASDAQ collapsed. I think it was 2002. But one of the products that we were about to market, I think it was for the Christmas period of that year, was a set of 2 or 3 computer games with an odor track and an output device, a whiffer, where we used the odor to enhance the pleasure in the game itself, but also as part of the strategy of the game. I remember one of the ideas was a game in which I think a princess or a queen was abducted, kidnapped, and the whole goal of the game was to free her. And at the final stage, when you had almost no strength left as the player, and you come to this hall where there are 3 doors, and you have only enough strength to break open one of the doors, and you know that the abducted princess is behind one of those doors, the thing that you were supposed to do was to hit the whiffer button and smell behind each of the 3 doors. And when you identify the perfume that the princess wore at the beginning of the game, which we were supposed to remember, then you know which door to break into. And of course, I think maybe a very interesting application for which you could say the problem is more or less solved would be if we could transmit a MasterChef program in real time with maybe a tiny nose piece that emitted small numbers of molecules in order to accompany a MasterChef program. Because I know a lot of people who really enjoy these cooking programs, and I find it a little bit difficult to understand how they can you have so much pleasure from these programs if they cannot taste or smell what is going on there. And of course, as a side remark, most of what we taste is really done by smell, except for the 4 or 5 particular tastes that come from our tongues. So why is this problem still unsolved, and why is it much, much harder than the analogous problems for sight and sound, which were solved, as we said, at the beginning of the 19th century for sight and in the mid-19th century or the latter third of the 19th century for sound? And I think the answer is obvious. Odors are not waves, but molecules. For vision and audio, both of those things have waves, light waves, audio waves, and we know how to do Fourier transforms, we know how to do inverse Fourier transforms. So going from the capture to the reproduction is something that we know exactly how to do. We know how to encode and how to decode. But in odors, these are not waves, but molecules. And how do you instruct an output device, a whiffer, to emit molecules which would be a good enough imitation of the original odor that was sniffed in by the sniffer? How do you do the encoding and decoding of this? Is completely non-trivial, which is the reason why this problem is not yet solved. I should remark that no one knows when the problem will be finally solved, even in a very crude way, just like Niepce's crude photographs and Alexander Graham Bell's maybe noisy, scratchy, inaccurate transmission of speech or of sound. But all I'm interested in is the first time that someone will be able to solve this. And of course, we're talking not only about roses and coffee and screeching tires, but the problem has to be solved for every single odor, including those that neither you nor I have ever smelled or experienced in our lives. So if we go to, I don't know, to the depth of some jungle and we bump into an unusual creature that no one has ever seen before, a purple giraffe with yellow stripes, we want to be able to capture the odor of that animal, even though this is something that no one has any idea what it would be like, and to reproduce it in a reliable, recognizable way. And I will be talking about recognizability a little bit later. I won't get into the biology or the chemistry of olfaction, but suffices to say that in our olfactory system, we have several hundred different kinds of receptors, and the actual message that our brain gets when we sniff something is a very complicated combination of the responses of these several hundred different kinds of receptors, which are somehow combined and give us the perception of smell in our brain, which goes to show that among other reasons, this goes to show that the issue of olfaction is very, very complicated. To give you an amusing feeling of the fact that this is still a problem, about 9 years ago, on April 1st, Google had something called Nose, which appeared on their search pages, and you would see something like a dumpster, and people also sniffed orange juice, garlic, grapefruit, movie theater, Christmas tree, and so on. And of course, the joke was that they gave you the impression that very soon you would be able to actually carry this out and get the smell coming out of your computer. I'm putting this up here in order to to emphasize that this was considered a joke. It was an April 1st hoax, and the fact that it was considered a joke and it was actually quite funny attests to the fact that the problem is still considered very, very difficult. I do claim that a solution to this problem will involve things that are quite obvious, such as chemistry and electronics, because we have to release molecules very accurately. Physics, brain science, we have to understand what our brain does when it senses an odor. Engineering, even the issue of the pipe that through which the molecules will be delivered to your nostrils or close to your nostrils. Even the material with which you build such a pipe will have to be very carefully engineered, because you don't want it to be contaminated by the previous odor or two, and so on. Psychophysics, obviously, because we have to understand the kind of sensations that people have when they smell something. Why mathematics and computer science is something that I will explain in a few minutes. A few words about the hardware. The sniffer, as I say, is a device, and that device should be able to map odor molecules or combinations or mixtures of molecules to numbers in some space. And again, I will mention something about this later. Forget about these mathematical letters. In general, an odor should result in a list of numbers, 10, 15, 20, 100, whatever. And there are such devices. They are called electronic noses. Here are some ones from about a decade or two ago. They're used by very large companies such as NASA. But by and large, these devices, which sometimes cost $100,000, are used to make binary decisions. Is this cheese okay, or is it bad? Is there other explosives in this bag over here? Can I use this kind of wrapper to wrap a particular candy bar so that within a few months the taste or the smell of the candy bar will remain the same? So these are usually used to make binary decisions: yes or no, bad or good, exists or doesn't exist, present or not present. And this is a little bit like saying that I've solved photography by building a very expensive device that can decide whether the light in this office in which I'm recording the lecture is less bright or more bright than the light outside in the corridor, or whether the combination of colors in this video that you're seeing is more warm, like orange, red colors, than blue, green, cold colors. And I don't want a binary decision. I would like a device or a pair of devices, a sniffer and a whiffer, that are able to reproduce an entire odor the way it is, not just make a decision about yes or no. So that is what photography did for us in 1826 with Nietzsche, and this is what we want here. We don't want to use electronic noses just to make a binary decision. We want to use electronic noses, sniffers, in order to be able to instruct an output device to mimic the input odor properly. The whiffer itself, just like a printer which has 3 or 4 colors of ink, it would involve a palette of basic odors. I'm putting this in quotation marks because no one knows exactly how many of these would be needed. Current common knowledge estimates that if you carefully choose between 50 and 100 odorants, you can actually span at least the space of human recognizable odors if you can mix these with a single % resolution. So give me 13% of this, 5% of that, 0% of the other, 1% of the fourth, and so on. And the whiffer should, of course, have the ability to release very tiny quantities of these molecules, these mixtures, in a controlled fashion at a given point in time, and then to stop that and to release something else. I say very minute quantities because our experience with playing around with such devices is that it suffices to have a very small amount of molecules in order to accompany, for example, a to accompany a, excuse me for a moment, to accompany, for example, a movie that shows someone eating pizza and drinking orange juice, and you want to get the feeling of the orange juice on the pizza, it's enough to have a very tiny amount of molecules, and that will do the job. So we have a palette of several odors with the output device that is really the whiffer. Actually, in 2002, this company I was involved in, we built a very nice whiffer. It didn't look like this. This was the plan. It looked rather crude. By the time the company collapsed, as I mentioned earlier with the NASDAQ, this did not really get manufactured widely, but our whiffer had the ability to mix about 60 different odors with maybe not single percent resolution, but a resolution of between 3 to 5%, and it did a very good job of that. But the main point here is building the sniffer, and as I say, electronic noses exist. Today you can build an electronic nose for relatively cheaply, and whiffers are something that can be built pretty easily. We built one, as I said, already 20 years ago. Building these two devices, the camera and the printer, the sniffer and the whiffer, that is the easy part of the problem. The difficult part of the problem is to encode and decode. In other words, to find a way to use the sniffer's digital signature, the vector of numbers, to instruct the whiffer to mix those odors that it has inside in order to mimic any input odor whatsoever. And we want it to be done in a way that is the output odor is sufficiently well imitated to be recognizable by humans using their real world experience, something I will explain a little later. Now let's get back to the question of what does someone like myself, I'm a computer scientist, a mathematician, what does someone like me have to do with any of this? Well, the very brief answer is that among other things, we have to be able to build mappings, correlations between the various odor spaces that are involved or that will be involved in this endeavor of building an odor reproduction system. And here are what I think are the four most important spaces. So of course is the eNose output. As I said, an electronic nose gives you a vector of numbers. So the collection of all vectors of numbers for all odors is a space, is an odor space. The molecular properties. Molecules have properties. They have atoms. The atoms are arranged in certain ways. There's a three-dimensional structure. There's a folding property. And if you have several kinds of molecules mixed, then you have even more of these. All of these essentially, in principle, can be listed. And you can make some kind of organization of all the properties of the molecules of a particular odor. And this is a space too. The brain response, as I mentioned, there are several hundred olfactory receptors in our olfactory system, and what the brain gets is a space too. And maybe the most slippery and elusive space here is the human odor perception. Does a particular human being think of this odor as being pleasant or unpleasant, fruity, burny, all kinds of properties like that? This kind of forms the human odor perception. And we want to be able, for example, to map one to the other, to take an eNose output and predict what the brain will be getting from its receptors and so on. Maybe to predict from the molecular properties what the human would feel about a particular odor, and so on and so forth. And I very briefly want to tell you about a work that I did with my students over several years in the early 2000s, which maybe would seem now to be kind of primitive experimentation, but they were novel at the time. No one had done things like this before. And we actually worked with two electronic noses, two sniffers, one that cost around $70,000. This is the electronic nose. It was connected to a PC and a sampler, and it was based on metal oxide sensors and another kind. I think it had 16, if I remember correctly, 16 different sensors of various types. And we also had a much cheaper handheld sniffer, an electronic nose, which worked with polymer sensors. Of course, this was a lot less accurate. We worked with both of those. And I want to show you two results. This was done with my PhD student, Liran Carmel, in 2003. And it shows in 2 dimensions, plotted on 2 dimensions, using the Moses, the more expensive electronic nose, what we found happened when we mixed 2 different odorants. Here you see the clusters of several sniffings of this light blue odorant, which name is over here. When we make the concentration grow, the plotting in 2 dimensions grows linearly, which is quite nice in these rates of concentration, and the same occurs over here. So further to the right, you get higher concentration, and when the concentration is very high, the chemical response of the electronic nose gets slightly less accurate. But the interesting thing here is the yellow, which is a 50-50 combination of both of these basic odorants, and the dark red, if you can see this, which is a 75%, 25% combination. Here, of course, 75% of this, so it pulls the response down 75%. We were very, very excited by seeing this kind of graph for the first time, because it gives an indication that you can kind of predict what will happen in certain kinds of mixtures. We did not do hundreds of experiments with hundreds of chemicals. We did a few just to get a feeling for the way this, in principle, can be controlled. So this was our first glimpse into some kind of predictability of what happens when you mix different chemicals, what happens to their odors. In another piece of work done also with Liran Carmel and Oded Shacham, we were able to map one of our electronic noses, the more expensive one, into the cheaper one. And to explain what you see here, the circle are samples taken with the second electronic nose. The diamonds show in 2 dimensions here what happens when you sniff the odor with your first electronic nose and you apply the algorithm that we were able to build in order to move from the first electronic nose's space into the space of the second electronic nose. And of course, the closer these are to each other, the better the mapping is. If I zoom in here to this area down on the bottom left, we see that some of these are really, really very, very nice, almost identical. In a couple of cases, it was a little disappointing. But again, this is a feasibility test for the ability by hard work to map one olfaction space to a completely different one, in this case, of a different electronic nose. In 2010, the PhD project of Rafi Haddad, carried out jointly by Noam Sobel supervising and myself supervising, we were able to build a way, an algorithmic mathematical way, to predict from an electronic nose output the degree of pleasantness that a human would associate with any given input odor. I think we had 4 levels of pleasantness. Maybe number 1 was terrible. I'm not going to go near this again. And number 4 was very pleasant, almost heavenly odor. And this was published in 2010. More recently, 2020, I think a very exciting piece of work. Again, a complete PhD thesis of Aaron Ravia, also done under the joint supervision of Noam Sobel and myself, which appeared in a Nature article, the end of 2010, concentrates on the similarity of odor mixtures. So here we're interested in figuring out whether we can mimic one odor by a mixture of other odors. And what we were able to do there, I think, brings us a significant step closer to the holy grail of odor reproduction, although we're still very far from that. And that paper reports on 3 main achievements: a reliable measure of the similarity of odors, a model that can predict similarity, and significantly, a method for constructing these metamers, which are distinct, non-overlapping mixtures of odors that to a human being smell the same. So So up to now, I essentially described the problem, why I think it is an important problem, a very difficult one. I must comment here that it's possible, of course, that an odor reproduction system will surface tomorrow morning or next month. Maybe some of these large companies like Apple or Microsoft or Facebook are working on, most likely they're working on this kind of problem, and maybe the secrecy results in the fact that we don't know exactly what they're doing, and maybe this problem will be solved more closely to present times than I think. But I think I know enough about this problem to realize how difficult it is, and I will be very surprised to see it being solved in the next few months. I think it should take several more years. But what I would like to do now, and I hope that up to now I've been able to somehow convey to you the difficulty of this problem. Now I'd like to raise a more modest problem as a kind of thought experiment. So suppose someone claims to have solved the odor reproduction problem, and he or she comes along, here's my sniffer, here's my whiffer, problem solved. Please, give me the Nobel Prize or give me a lot of money in order for me to tell you how it's done. The question I'm asking the audience, and I asked myself a few years ago, is how do we test the solution? How could we carry out some protocol that gives us reasonable confidence or serious confidence that the person claiming to have solved the problem has indeed solved it? In order to kind of convince you that it's not that simple, let's go back to Niepce for a moment. If you were with Niepce in his apartment when he took that famous photograph, which, by the way, of course, was not just click. This was a device that the exposure probably took quite a long time. And he showed you this metal plate with the scene out of his window. And you said to him, you did not paint that or draw that. He said, no, I captured it with this device over here. I think maybe you would have said to him, do that once again from another window. I just want to see that you actually did that. And he did it, another one, took another photograph, and you see the result. And by that time, you're more or less convinced that he solved the problem. So maybe if you go to a place that is very dark or very, very bright, it would not work. But in principle, in a crude way, seeing one or two or three examples of how he did that magic convinces you that the problem has been solved for the first time. The same with Alexander Graham Bell. Maybe you said to him, ask Mr. Watson what the time is, and that's enough. Please come here. And he comes. What is the time? And he tells you the time, and you're convinced that the audio reproduction problem has been solved, again, at least in a crude fashion. May not work for very, very loud or very, very soft or very, very high pitch audio, but problem solved at least in a crude way. But here, maybe the person's claiming to have solved the problem knows that I like particular kind of coffee and I like orange juice, so they've put these odors in their output device, so that if I just do one or two simple tests, this is not enough to convince ourselves that this has been solved and that the problem has been solved for every possible input odor. The main problems, of course, is that in general, there's no wall-to-wall way to name or verbally describe odors. So if you think of testing the person's validity of the person's claim that the problem has been solved by doing 100 experiments and asking people to say what they have smelled from the output device, this will not work, because you can describe coffee and orange juice, but you cannot describe the odor of that purple giraffe that I mentioned earlier, and no one can describe the odor in my grandmother's attic, for example. You can say a bit stuffy, but to give someone a reliable description of an odor, even for someone in the wine business or the food business, will not work. So verbalizing odors is not going to work. So asking people what they smell is not going to work either. And maybe trying to find a perfect imitation in some chemical way, it will not work either, because perfect imitation doesn't exist even for image and sound. So we have to do something which is kind of basing our experience in odors on our on the way we sense the world around us. So I'm going to skip this slide for lack of time, and I would like to give you what I think is a reasonable solution to this question of how to test a candidate solution to the odor reproduction problem, with two key ideas. The first idea is to do an immersion of the odor into the way we see and hear around us. And so I propose to build two teams, a challenger team and a tester team. The challenger team chooses locations, 100 locations, 1,000 locations, and they walk around the world with, say, a camcorder, a video camera, with a boom microphone, and with the candidate sniffer. And they take maybe 10-second clips of all kinds of places in the world. They take the video, they sense the audio, and they sniff the odor. And then a tester team is asked to sit in a room, and they are given, say, 10 or 12 clips taken by the challenger team, shown on a screen. So on the screen you see what the video is. From the loudspeakers you hear what the audio was, and there is an odor button. And what we're doing really is a simple lineup. We want the tester to sit in front of these screens and to see the clips whenever, show me the second clip, show me the fifth clip. And then there is an odor button. The tester people press the odor button and they get only one odor, which matches only one of the clips. And they have to say which of the clips is, to their olfactory opinion, the most fitting clip from which this odor has been generated. So if you see my grandmother's attic and a purple giraffe and a cup of coffee and a pizza and so on, and you get a particular odor, you have to say, this is the coffee, or this is the orange juice, or this, to the best of my opinion, is David's grandmother's attic, or this, to the best of my opinion, is the purple giraffe in the jungle. And of course, we do this many times with many different collections of clips, all generated by the challenger team, whose role in life is to shoot down the claim that this person has indeed solved the problem. So they will give kind of difficult cases. And the tester team acts like the Supreme Court. They have to be completely impartial, and all they have to do is to point to the one that they think is the most appropriate clip for this particular odor. And as I said, we do this many times. We carry out statistical manipulations which remove the outliers and correct all kinds of other statistical problematics. And if this is done again and again and again, and each time the tester team, or most of the times, or virtually all of the times, the tester team is able to identify the proper clip, then our confidence grows very rapidly that the person with the sniffer and clipper and whiffer have in fact solved the problem. However, with this simple lineup, and maybe I should mention here that the key idea, as I said, is not just to show you an odor and to ask you what you've smelled, to have you sniff an odor and ask you what you smelled, or describe it, or say where it came from, but to immerse that odor in a clip where you see and hear something in the real world. And this helps you very dramatically in identifying which is the possible framework in the real world from which this odor could have come. But there is a problem with this simple lineup. And the problem is really the possible over-eagerness or maybe viciousness on the part of the challenger. So if the challenger wants to shoot down the claim that this person has solved the problem, they can do all kinds of unusual things, such as take a very nice 10-second clip from some hill in a very pastoral landscape with trees and birds chirping in the distance, but they're standing, say, right in front of a cave which has a very nasty smell coming out of it. So what the tester team gets to see is a very nice spring-like hilly countryside with flowers and birds, and they get to hear the wind and they get to hear the chirp of the birds. But what they smell is something that has nothing to do with this, and they will never be able to identify this smell with this particular clip. And if this is done often by the challenging team, the testing team will not be able to carry out their objective assessment of the lineup. So the solution to this is the second key idea, which is to make the test conditional, and I'll explain this in a moment. And here I want to remark that in principle it is possible to capture the actual molecules of odor and to keep them around for a period of time, say for days or for some weeks. This, of course, will become much better in the future. We can take a headspace technique to retain the actual molecules from where we are, and not only sniff them by the candidate sniffer. And so what we will be doing here is we will never require the testers to identify something that they could not have identified from the actual real odors in the area. So if you were to stand with your back to this cave, you would never really know what the odor is from, even if you got the actual smell from the cave itself, if you were actually physically there, not only what the whiffer emits. And the way to do this is by a conditional lineup. I will explain this. I don't think you have to read all of this. We will be dividing the tester team into two sub-teams. Sub-team number 1 and sub-team number 2. Sub-team number 1, when they press the odor button, when they're doing the lineup, they get the real molecules which were actually taken from the scene itself. And the second team, team number 2, when they press the button, they get the whiffer output. So all we want to do here is to request the identification by those who get the whiffer output only in those cases where the sub-team that gets the real odor sample succeeds. So if the people who get the real odor are not able to say where it comes from, then the people who get the reproduced odor, the candidate sniffer, a whiffer odor, are not required to succeed either. So we'd simply ignore those sessions for which the team that gets the real odor sample have failed. And this, of course, gives us the confidence that the candidate sniffer and whiffer actually do the job. And I think that this test is really a subtle combination of human real-world recognition of odors and imitation of these odors, of course, inspired by Niepce and Bell's breakthroughs, but to some extent also inspired by the Turing test for artificial intelligence, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And as I said, let me just put this in simple words, the test gets around the fact that we cannot name or verbally describe odors by using video and audio and immersion. No words have to be said by anyone. The testers just sit there and they decide what is the clip that is most matching, in their opinion, to the odor that they sniff. And the test also eliminates these unfair and maybe vicious challenges by never ever requiring of the whiffer, of the reproduced odor, what we do not already require of the original odor. And of course, the important point here is that when we insist on recognizability of odors and we use the immersion technique to emerge it in audio and video, this test will work best for scene-related odors. It will not work very well for example, for different chemicals in a laboratory, because the laboratory will always look like a laboratory, the chemicals will always look different. If you will not be able to discriminate between those odors very easily. Let me skip that and just close this lecture by saying that the main thing I wanted to convey was the importance of and the difficulty of this holy grail of building a sniffer whiffer pair to carry out odor reproduction, just the way we take pictures or film videos and reproduce them on screen or on paper, and the way we are able to read in audio signals and reproduce them on loudspeakers, even very high quality ones, such as a concert hall. This is still, I think, far from being solved for olfaction. And so that was the main part of the lecture. And towards the end, I gave you this little thought experiment of how to test the solution when one comes along, and I'm sure a solution will come along in the next few years. And I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope this has been of interest.